The Antifa, there's a group of anti-fascists called the Black Bloc, which do tend to get violent. Their idea is, look, nonviolence hasn't worked, and we are going to try to stop this. But they wouldn't have been there. They wouldn't have been anywhere near there had it not been for the fact that white supremacists, neo-Nazis, were out scaring the living daylights out of most of the people in that town.
Oh, really? Let's put that claim to the test. Was there Nazis in Portland, too, the day before, as Antifa ran charged at your run-of-the-mill Trump supporter conservatives, beating them with sticks? Were there Nazis in the KKK there at the inauguration too, as Antifa ran amok, beating people in the streets nearly to death, smashing limos and looting buildings? How about when Antifa charged at police, trying to beat them with their sticks and flagpoles? I guess the cops were undercover KKK. Did a Nazi rally take place in Berkeley that I'm not aware of? When Antifa bashed people over the heads with bike locks, put M80s inside glass peanut butter jars and threw them at Trump supporters? Was this nice-looking plump gentleman wearing a Star Wars t-shirt an undercover member of a white supremacist group as they beat him in the streets? How about this young gentleman, a run-of-the-mill conservative, standing there peacefully, all of a sudden gets mobbed by Antifa? I guess they thought that he may have been a Nazi psyop. What about when the alt-left rampaged and rioted unprovoked through the streets, breaking Starbucks and Bank of America windows to bits? Was the Bank of America and Starbucks harboring Nazis? How about as they destroyed UC Berkeley because of a certain speaker coming to town? Or pepper sprayed this defenseless woman in the face? Or hit this poor woman over the head with a skateboard? Or beat this bystander on the ground almost to death with sticks to the head? How about when Antifa, the alt-left, rampaged and rioted through San Jose, beating up Hispanic Trump supporters as Trump showed up for his rally, beating up anyone who had a USA shirt on? What about in Costa Mesa when Trump had his rally there? Innocent bystanders and Trump supporters were beaten up just for being there by Antifa and the alt-left. Here you see a Trump supporter followed by a mob and then viciously attacked and knocked out for wearing a Trump shirt. Let's hear what CNN's best actor has to say about all this. Van Jones.
If you can't tell the difference between a serpent and an earthworm, you have no business leading. We have a terrorist movement in this country aimed at black people.
If the viewers watching right now, take a look at what happens to this woman who is holding an American flag. She's holding an American flag, and a protester comes to her, drags her along there, pulls her anyway. Let's watch this. You can see her flag lying up on the ground. And this is the kind of thing that we hate to see in these protests. I mean, this is where it starts to take that really horrendous turn. And then we're looking at the people, Buck, that you cited earlier as being the anarchists.
I was just going to say, first of all, that's assault, what just happened there. So you already have people that think that they're able to violate the free speech rights of others and break the law. You can't grab something out of someone's hand and drag them along on the ground. That's their property, and that's assault. And then you also did catch a glimpse of what would be...
She's clearly upset.
Clearly upset. Of course, anyone would be. She's holding up an American flag in Boston. You would think that this should be...
Christy,
people should be coming by giving her a high five. Instead, they're pulling her on the street.
On the ground now. Christy, your thoughts on all of this as it unfolds?
I believe that there is a tremendous danger here in making false equivalencies between. I think we're in danger of doing the same thing that, frankly, the president got in trouble on Tuesday for doing, which is by saying that there's violence on many sides.
You have the left refusing to acknowledge the evil of Antifa. You have the right refusing to acknowledge the evils of the alt-right or trying to blame the evils of the alt-right on the SJWs. The social justice warrior left, the Antifa, race politics, intersectionality left is vile, and Antifa is getting violent, and all of this has been true for months. And the alt-right is a vile, disgusting, repulsive, utterly morally inconceivable movement. Let's just jump right in. Let's start with what actually happened. So here's some of the video. On Saturday, there was something called Unite the Right. Unite the Right was an event organized by people like Richard Spencer. A bunch of white supremacists decide that they are going to, or white separatists, white nationalists decide they're going to put together this march in Charlottesville, Virginia, and things take a turn for the worse because Antifa shows up. And some of the protesters, I'm sure, are people who are not Antifa. They just want to protest the white supremacy, the white supremacism that they're seeing on display. And some of the people definitely are Antifa. The violent people are Antifa. It's sort of like what happened at Berkeley when Milo Yiannopoulos spoke there. You had some leftist protesters who showed up, and then Antifa came in and decided to make the whole thing violent. We've seen this sort of thing happen all over the country, so that's nothing new. Okay, we saw that happen at Berkeley, and we've had on people on the show who were victims of that violence in Berkeley. We've seen it happen in Sacramento, California. We saw it happen in Seattle again over the weekend. So we're going to show you some of this footage. So here is a little bit of the video of Antifa getting violent in Charlottesville on Saturday. So you can see it's hard to tell which protesters are which. Some of the white supremacists carrying Confederate flags. I guess some of them had Nazi flags. Just disgusting people walking down the street, and some media members. And then you're going to see, in just a second, some Antifa people in the far left of your screen jump into action, and now everybody's pounding on each other. People swinging flags at each other, a girl getting hit, and her going after a guy. So, and turns into a melee. The left has tried to suggest that Antifa was not involved in the violence in any way. Now, Antifa being involved in the violence does not justify either the perspective or the violence you're going to see from the alt-right. Okay, none of that justifies any of this. But it would be remiss, factually speaking, to pretend that Antifa was not involved in this. Antifa is a communist group. Antifa is basically a bunch of reds fighting a bunch of brown shirts. So we're now having a replay of the Weimar Republic, reds versus brown shirts on America's streets. One of the things that was amazing is that a reporter for the New York Times acknowledged as much. A reporter from the New York Times, Cheryl Gay Stolberg, she tweeted out, the hard left seemed as hate-filled as alt-right. I saw club-wielding Antifa beating white nationalists being led out of the park. Okay, and a bunch of people on the left then hit her, and they said, well, they weren't hate-filled. They weren't hate-filled. And she retracted, and she said, oh, they weren't hate-filled. They were just violent. Here is clip 26. There's one of the guys arrested in Charlottesville was a counter-protester who punched a female reporter.
Lauren, I'm sorry, please put that away. I understand. Can you please put that away? Stop recording! Hey, look.
Okay, so you can't really see much there, but the woman who's holding the camera is a reporter, and she's socked in the head by one of the Antifa, presumably counter-protesters. This is not rare, okay? So to pretend that the left is not violent in these situations it's just dishonest, okay? So you can see that the Charlottesville organizer, right? People were celebrating this, but the organizer of this Charlottesville march, he was doing a press conference on Saturday after all of this, and he was punched in the face and chased off the grounds. Where are the cops for all of this? There he is, this twerp, right, getting chased off the grounds. And then you'll see someone come in and clock him. Okay, so they chase him away. Again, is any of that justified in a civilized society? No, it really is not. This guy's a piece of crap. That doesn't mean that he gets to punch pieces of crap in the United States. Right, there he goes down. Okay, so again, the violence. So again, the violence was happening from both the left and the right here. And by the way, it's happening across the country from the left. Okay, so in Richmond, there was a photojournalist who was covering another one of these rallies, and the photojournalist was hit by a member of Antifa. Here it is, clip 27.
We're here. We're gay. We fight the KKK. We're here.
I mean, I don't know if you're present for the whole like during the course. Stop filming, bro.
We're here.
Stop filming.
So someone says to him, stop filming, to this reporter, and boom, the guy gets hit, right? So again, another one of these Antifa protesters who decides to hit a reporter. In Seattle yesterday, there was another one of these rallies. This time it was not a white supremacist versus red rally. This was apparently just a pro-Trump group that has openly disavowed any sort of white supremacism. And the Antifa protesters show up and start beating the crap out of people. The police are trying to protect the people who are marching. And you can see they're starting to be hit by the left-wing protesters. The police are being hit by the left-wing protesters. Okay, so this sort of stuff has been happening all over the country. The left has been ignoring it because they prefer to focus in on the narrative about right-wing violence. Now, to pretend that right-wing violence doesn't exist is stupid. Okay, it does. Okay, when I say right-wing, I mean alt-right, because there is a difference between constitutional conservatism, as I'll explain, and the alt-right. The alt-right is anti-SJW, but they are not conservative in any marked way, in any real way. They oppose the Declaration of Independence. They oppose the Constitution of the United States. They are not in favor of individual liberty. They are not in favor of equality before God. They're not in favor of any of those. And so to call it right-wing violence is even there a bit of a misnomer. We're going to talk today a lot about why the left seems to now be defending violence, why it is that Antifa has to be turned into heroes, why that was their ultimate goal in the first place. It is clear that one of the goals of the left, and it has been for now a year, and Charlottesville allowed them to do this with some level of credibility, is they are now attempting pretty overtly to legitimize the Antifa movement. The Antifa movement is a deeply violent movement that seeks to use violence against all the people they oppose. And the media have basically covered up the level of violence that Antifa is engaged in. So yesterday, we got news that another rally in Richmond, Virginia, where a bunch of Antifa people showed up, there was a journalist who really got clocked. We have a couple of pictures of what happened to that journalist. So here is a picture of the journalist after the journalist got clocked by an Antifa member. And here is another picture of the journalist's head after the journalist was clocked by the Antifa member. 4 staples in the head, concussion from the Antifa member. This was not covered in any real way by the media more broadly. They basically suggested that none of this sort of stuff happened, and that when Trump said that the alt-left was charging into people, that was not true. Again, it was true. Okay, what Trump said there was true. He said some things during that press conference that really I thought were quite upsetting morally, but that was not one of them. When he went after what he called the alt-left, by which he meant Antifa, he was exactly right to do so. Antifa is a violent, vile group. And you're seeing this, unfortunately, this notion spread around the country that Antifa, violence against Nazis, is okay. We had this conversation a while back when Richard Spencer, who is a neo-Nazi, a white supremacist, was punched in the head. And a lot of people on the left celebrated. Yay, Richard Spencer was punched in the head. And I said at the time, I think Richard Spencer is vile, but you can't punch Nazis in the head. We live in a civilized country. Okay, you shouldn't be punching people in the head. This is why we have police. Ideally, I mean, it's one thing to defend yourself. It's a full other thing to go somewhere with the intent of engaging in violence. But the left seems now ensconced in this idea. There were 2 Washington Post op-eds in the course of 48 hours basically endorsing Antifa. So one of them was from a professor named N.D.B. Connolly of Johns Hopkins University, and he wrote an entire piece called "Charlottesville Showed that Liberalism Can't Defeat White Supremacy, Only Direct Action Can." In other words, we can't have votes, we can't have conversations, we can't have debates. No, only white supremacy. White supremacy can only be defeated by throwing what he calls rocks. And this is seriously what he writes. He writes, "Liberalism, paper, preserves our country's long commitment to contracts. Under liberalism, citizens stand in contract with their government. The government's job, in turn, has been to enforce contracts between individuals and groups. But," Connolly continues, "white supremacy represents our culture's scissors. There have been people historically cut out of our social contract, but there is a rock," right? It's rock, paper, scissors. There is a rock. Resistance. Okay, resistance is the rock. And he says, "Rocks can look like armed self-defense or nonviolent direct action campaigns." Well, those are not the same thing at all. Okay, nonviolent direct action campaigns like boycotts, that's not the same thing as punching somebody in the head or throwing rocks. He goes on to talk about why violence is okay. He says, "In April 1968, amid a flurry of other rocks, riots shook American cities following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It took that rolling unrest, not the promise of further economic growth, to spur President Lyndon Johnson and Congress to action. Within a week, they had passed the Fair Housing Act. Over the past century, liberalism, vexed by an ever-sharp, ever-cutting white supremacy, has needed these rocks. So riots are necessary. So burning down Detroit, burning down Los Angeles in the Watts riot, that was necessary." And then he concludes, "Segregationists have again assumed their pedestals in the Justice Department, the White House, and many other American temples." Okay, by the way, Jeff Sessions immediately called this a hate crime and said he was going to investigate this as a terrorist incident. So that's just nonsense. And when he says segregationists in the White House, Trump isn't a segregationist. Okay, I don't like what Trump said. I've been very clear that I didn't like what Trump said on Tuesday or on Saturday. I think Trump sometimes fellow travels with the alt-right because he thinks they're his friends, but he's not a segregationist. Okay, Connolly concludes, "Paper alone won't drive them out. Start throwing rocks." So overtly calling for violence in the streets. Self-defense is one thing. Riots are not self-defense. Riots are not self-defense. I'm not talking here about the lynch mob comes to get a black guy and he shoots them. Good for him. Okay, but I'm talking here about what he's talking about, the idea that Antifa needs to go out in the streets, and if the Nazis are marching, Antifa needs to go out and punch them in the head. He's not the only person saying this. Mark Bray is a historian and lecturer at Dartmouth University, and he's defending Antifa. He was on MSNBC fully defending this vile, violent, communist anarchist group.
How do far-right movements grow? I say they grow by becoming normalized, by not being confronted, by being able to present themselves as family-friendly and respectable. So part of the reason why the alt-right called themselves alt-right is to present that mainstream image. And the opposition that people showed in Charlottesville really marred and tainted that. So I think that by showing up and confronting it, it prevents the ability of being able to be presented as mainstream. And connected that, I think really you need to be able to prevent them from being able to organize. People who are involved in politics know that for movements to expand, they need to be able to organize and grow. And if you stop that, it prevents it.
Okay, this is sheer nonsense. What he is saying here, that people who engaged in violence with the Nazis and white supremacists in Charlottesville did the country a service, absolute crap. He specifically talks about how they helped stop Hitler, except for how they didn't stop Hitler. He says the first anti-fascists fought Benito Mussolini's black shirts in the Italian countryside, exchanged fire with Adolf Hitler's brown shirts in the taverns and alleyways of Munich, and defended Madrid from Francisco Franco's insurgent nationalist army. Yeah, how'd that go? All three of those times, the bad guys won. So how'd that go? I mean, I want to talk a little bit about this myth that armed violence by communists in the Weimar Republic would have stopped the Nazis. There was armed violence by communists in the Weimar Republic. It was one of the driving forces behind the Nazi success. People looked at the communists and they said, okay, if we have to decide between communist violence and fascist violence, we'll go with the fascists. It wasn't just that the communists and the Nazis went at one another. Paramilitary battles were common, by the way. Here's some statistics about the paramilitary battles. In the aftermath of World War I, the German army was essentially disbanded by the Versailles Treaty, and there were a lot of ex-military people roaming around. The communists grabbed some of them, and what were called the Freikorps, grabbed grabbed another, and they formed things like the Steel Helmets and the Freikorps, and these were all militia groups, basically local militia groups that wandered the countryside fighting each other and quote unquote defending the population from the various entities. From 1924 to 1929, it was claimed that 29 Nazi activists had been killed by communists. Communists reported 92 workers had been killed in clashes with fascists from 24 to 30. 26 members of the Steel Helmets were sort of this veterans group, were said to have fallen in the fight against communism. In 1930, the figures rose dramatically in the lead up to the Nazis taking power. This was a key factor in the rise of the Nazis. In 1930, the figures rose dramatically. The Nazis claimed to have suffered 17 deaths, rising to 42 in 1931, 84 in 1932. Remember, 1932 is the year the Nazis essentially paved their way to power. In 1932, the Nazis reported nearly 10,000 of their rank and file had been wounded in clashes with their opponents. Well, according to Mark Bray, wouldn't that have stopped them? I mean, you obviously had armed resistance. Why didn't that stop them? The communists reported 44 deaths in fights with the Nazis in 1930, 52 in 1931, 75 in the first 6 months of 1932 alone. And the number of dead in the year to March 1930 to March 1931 was no fewer than 300 dead in these various battles. I mean, serious stuff. I mean, it makes Charlottesville look like a piker's game. The number of people who are dying in these meetings. And communists would break up Nazi meetings. At one meeting, Krebs went and he broke up a Nazi speech by Hermann Göring. Right? Göring would become the second in command to Hitler. He said that he, quote, made sure that each man was armed with a blackjack or brass knuckles. A terrifying melee followed. Blackjacks, brass knuckles, clubs, heavy buckled belts, glasses, bottles were the weapons used. Göring, he stood calmly on the stage, his fists on his hips. Evans reports scenes like this were being played out all over Germany in the early 1930s. The Nazis made their money off these sorts of things. If you want to make the alt-right more popular, all you have to do is go out in the streets and fight them. Then they get to look tough. They get to look like they win. They get to look like they're victims at the same time, like they're fighting a defensive battle when really what they're doing is promulgating an evil ideology. Again, this is Richard Evans, okay? Goebbels made his reputation above all as regional leader of Berlin, where his fiery speeches, his incessant activity, his outrageous provocations of the Nazis' opponents, and his calculated staging of street fights and meeting hall brawls to gain the attention of the press won the party a mass of new adherents. Young, disenchanted men who have nothing better to do with their lives are looking for a movement to belong to and that will engage in violence. It makes them feel tough. It makes them feel special. This is why you see, Christopher Cantwell in that Vice video talking about how many guns he carries and how he works out all the time and makes himself more ready for violence. This is a thing, okay? And when Antifa plays right into their hands, not only are they doing something evil when they shut down normal conservatives, they're doing something evil when they fight these Nazis in the streets with their fists. Okay, that's why we have police in this country. Okay, we have very able police in this country. And the idea that we need Antifa in the streets as some sort of grand and glorious mission is really disgusting. It's a way of legitimizing a group that, by the way, is communist, anarchist, and fights law-abiding people too, not just white supremacists.